What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Pistonhead Garage. I'm Garrett, and on this episode, I'm finally going to finish the Z32 VG30 build and get it in the car. Unfortunately, I did have a lot of footage that got messed up, and there was no audio, and it kind of got garbled a bit, so I don't have everything. But I do have a lot, so I will go through that in this video, and then, of course, at the end of the video, I will show you the finished product behind me. Keep in mind this car's been sitting for about 6 months because it's wintertime here in northern Canada and we cannot drive when there's 3 feet of snow on the ground. So it is a bit dirty, but I'll take you over what we did that didn't get covered in the video footage. And of course, if you have any questions, make sure you put them in the comments. And yeah, I'll try to answer them as best I can. So without further ado, let's get into the build. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is install your NOx sensor, because the last thing you want to do is have your intake manifolds both on and then realize you forgot to install your NOx sensor. So I did that first. I cranked her down pretty tight just because I didn't want it to come loose and I want to make sure it registered to the block, tightly, I guess. And following that, I installed the ARP head studs. One thing I'm going to point out, now that I've discovered it, these studs are not all the same length. This one here and this one here are shorter than the rest. And that's because the hole here and here they're shallower. I believe because there's water passages or something probably below here that it can't go any further in like these ones can. And this one here, there's a bolt hole for the transmission that goes right through there, so that's probably why that one's like that. So yeah, just take a look at them when you get them out and maybe measure them before you start screwing them in. Otherwise, you're going to end up like me and going, why is this one not screwing all the way? And why does it sit half an inch higher than the rest of them? And then having to swap them all around. So anyway, they're all in there now. They're just hand tight. Just snug them down a little bit. You don't need any more than that because the tension of the nut when you torque them down is what actually holds the head down. The instructions say you can use red Loctite on these if you don't want them to ever come out again, which, I mean, presumably we don't want them to come out again, but I'm not going to worry about it because it's not actually necessary. So yeah, the next step is to get the dowels in for the locating of the heads, and then we'll throw the head gaskets on, and then the head should just drop right on. And once the head studs were installed correctly, I then installed the thermostat housing and heater pipe. And once that was bolted down, I could then install the head gaskets and drop the heads on. I used a dead blow hammer here to help seat the heads onto the dowels, the locating dowels on the block. Just make sure that everything's lined up straight and it should go on pretty smoothly. And of course, make sure everything is torqued to spec. In this case, I believe it was about 90 foot-pounds was the max torque, but of course you want to work that up in stages. I did 3 steps for this one. Okay, so now that the heads are bolted on, the lower intake plumbing can be installed. To do that, I cleaned all the surfaces, installed the gaskets, and then of course torqued it down. Next up, I did the same thing on each intake cam side of each head, installing the VVT solenoids, sealing with some RTV, and torquing the spec. I was then ready to install the cams using some assembly lube, and everything was torqued down to spec in the order that was specified by the service manual. Once the cams are in, I can then add some RTV to the back of the exhaust side of each head and put it in the cover that goes here. And then I just used a socket that was the right size to drive in the seals. In the case of the one side, I wasn't able to seat it all the way with the socket, so I used a flat punch basically and just tapped it in a little bit at a time. Once that was all done, I installed the water pump. Followed by the inner timing covers. Next, I installed the cam gears. Of course, you want to make sure when you're sliding these cam gears into the cam seals that they slide in smoothly, so lubricate them so you don't tear a seal or something like that. And then just for fun, I loosely attached the engine mounts here. And then on go the valve covers. Now that the engine is fully sealed up, I installed the brackets for the power steering and for the alternator, as well as the timing sprocket and one of the idler pulleys. And last but not least, the timing belt goes on with the timing tensioner. I didn't do any detailed video on this one, but if you do want that, I can probably do that in the future. And once the timing was done, I could then install the lower timing cover. The old coolant pipes that are located right here in the front of the engine were getting pretty rusted out, so we replaced those. Next up, I installed one of the main water pipes here that goes to the rad and the upper timing cover on this side. And then before installing the other cover, I installed the cast bracket and the cast. followed by the thermostat and the lower water pipe. And then next up, I installed the new injectors into the stock fuel rails, and I installed the stock fuel rails into the lower intake plenum. Once that was done, I installed the oil filter tree and then bolted on the turbo manifolds. And of course, once the manifolds are on, I can then install the new turbos and then run the feed line and the oil drain line. Following that, I installed the wastegate actuator vacuum lines, as well as the heater core pipes. These are modified pipes that I blocked off all the inlets and outlets for the turbos, because these turbos are just oil cooled, whereas the factory turbos were oil and water cooled. So these pipes are only for the heater. Throw on the intake for the turbos and some accessories, and we are ready to drop the motor in the car. Okay, so I didn't film it, obviously. I didn't do that because it was a bit of a struggle to get the engine in, and there's a lot of messing around we did. So basically, I'll explain a couple of the things that we encountered. On the passenger side, the wastegate actuator was sticking out too far. With these turbos not being stock, the mounting points for those wastegate actuators was not going to work with the orientation of the compressor housing. So we had to kind of clock the turbos a bit differently, which meant that nothing lined up. So I kind of jimmy rigged it a bit to make sure it would clear the engine side of things, but it wouldn't clear the actual engine bay when the engine was coming up, because we brought it up the same way we took it out. We put the engine on some blocks, dropped the car on the lift down on top of the engine. But yeah, so that didn't work, so we had to raise the car up again. Did some jimmy rigging over there as well, made a little bracket to tuck it in closer. We had to bend the rod for the actuator a little bit and grind a little bit off the inside of the linkage to the wastegate flap itself, because it wouldn't open all the way once it was positioned where I needed it. So we got that done, and then on this side, the main issue was that the intake tube that bolts the front of the turbo, that allows the air to come from the front of the car into the turbo, was clocked too far to the outside, so it was also hitting on the inside of the frame rail on the engine bay. That, unfortunately, I wasn't sure if I would be able to fix with it out of the car, and now that I'm thinking about it, I probably should have done it with it out of the car, because it's going to be even harder to fix now that it's in the car. But anyway, this is the tube. It basically goes like this, and it points, upwards towards the intake. But it was clocked too far this way, this is basically the orientation that it sits right now. The way it's set up, it'll face like that, but it's down here, of course, way down in here. So it's still clocked too far outward by just a hair. So it needs to be turned about maybe 15 degrees or so this way, like so. So almost so it's pointing straight up. That's my goal, at least, is just to have it pointing straight up. So what I'm going to have to do is cut this flange off the back and then just rotate it and then weld it back together. That's already been done once on these, and I think that's where our problem came from, because we thought these were going to be wrong to begin with. And before actually physically testing them on the car, we just had them cut and re-welded to where we thought they were going to work. And this side, the passenger side, is fine, but the driver's side is completely off. So like I said, I have to cut this off, clock it to where it should be, and re-weld it. But then I have to get it back on the turbo. Now the bottom bolt will be a bit of a pain to get in, but the top bolt, I don't know if I can do it with the engine in the car at all. So we may end up having to drop the engine back out. The reason why I say that is because with the engine out of the car, I bolted this on. Like you can see there's some RTV on here because there's no gaskets for this. I bolted it on, but it took me like 20 minutes to a half an hour to get the top bolt to thread in. I fought with it for so long, mainly because I modified the bolt probably. The issue is the exhaust manifold is really close to where the bolt goes in. The bolt was too long for me to get it straight, so it actually started to thread. So what I did was put a die, screwed a die down onto the bolt, cut the bolt down maybe to half its length, and then spun the die out to fix the threads. Well, I think doing that, the threads are still not perfect, so just getting it to start in the hole was what I was fighting with. Once I had it started, I could kind of get a wrench in there half sideways and twist it tight enough to get it to seal, and then it was on. But yeah, like I said, now we're dealing with the fact that I have to put it on again with little to no space to get my hands in there, and dealing with that bolt as it is a pain in the ass as it goes. So yeah, so what I'm going to do first is cut this and get it tacked in the orientation where I think it should fit, and then just give it a quick test. If it's good, then we'll weld it solid, and then the next step will be to try to get it bolted on. If I can't get it bolted on with it like it is right now, I'm going to have to drop the engine out, bolt it back on, and then put the engine back in. At least now we know with everything else set up, it'll drop out and in really easily. It's tight, but there's actually a lot more room than I expected. The one other thing we messed up with, or that I messed up on with getting the engine in, was the dump pipes that come off the turbos. These turbos, right, like any turbos, twin turbo setup that you would get on an OEM car pretty much, they're not mirrored to each other. They are oriented the exact same way on both sides. And because of that, the outlet flanges are the same bolt pattern that face the same direction. So either dump pipe will fit on either side. I just swapped them side to side by accident. Wasn't really thinking about the way they were pointing, and then when we went to drop the car on it, they wouldn't fit at all. So we swapped those out. Took 10 minutes to switch the bolts over and switch the flanges over, and yeah, that was it. Everything else fits really nice. There's a shit ton of room in front of the engine. Mind you, there's going to be a rad and a big rad fan here, but I was surprised at how much room there was in front. And in the back, it's quite a lot more than I thought. There's actually, I want to say 3, maybe 4 inches between the back of the head and the firewall, which, as Kaylin pointed out to me, it's there because there used to be a whole lot of stuff back there, like EGR and other tubing and wiring and all that sort of stuff, because this is an engine that had emissions and all that sort of stuff originally, and we've deleted pretty much all of that. So that is why there's so much more room. Also, the heads themselves are not centered to each other on the block. Like this head here sits further forward than the head on this side, just because it is a V6, so the cylinders are also offset by an inch or so, or the pistons, whatever. So that's why there's more room on this side than on that side, because I guess technically on that side, behind the VTC solenoid, there's actually only about an inch of room, or less. I guess it'll depend. Once this engine is sitting more level, when we have the transmission installed, then we'll know for sure. But there's plenty of room for the wiring harness to come out, and everything else. I got the fuel lines from the hard lines that are on the body to come up into the battery compartment over here. This has a trunk-mounted battery, so all the fuel stuff is going to go in the far corner, which you probably can't see on camera right now. It'll go over there, the fuel pressure regulator and all that sort of stuff. So in the future, we could make a box that would cover that if we want to, or we could just leave it exposed. Doesn't really matter. But yeah, anyway, first things first, I got to cut this flange off, and then sort of clock it to where I think it should be, tack it, and give it a test. All right, here we go, another update. So yeah, I haven't been filming the actual process just because we've been really just kind of poking at it here and there. I've been working maybe like 2 hours a day on it. We've been working on this now for like a week or so since the motor's been put in. Maybe not that long, maybe 5 days. But anyway, so the rad's in. We've got the new machine motor rad mounted with the fancy little brackets here. I got the fan in. All the belts are on. All the accessories are all tightened down on the front here. Power steering is hooked up. The wiring harness I've started working on, adding things like the intake air temperature sensor. We've got the fuel pressure regulator over here. Fuel pressure regulator, fuel pressure sensor right next to it there. We've relocated the fuel filter down into the battery tray compartment. It used to be like right here up on the strut tower. So now it's down there because the battery's in the trunk. You can see here, this is where the power comes in from the battery and gets distributed. So power is hooked up to the car. The fuse box is basically wired. So I've got the ECU installed. Well, not installed, but it's plugged into the harness inside the car. And I fired that up, tested out the sensors that I could so far. I've got the oil pressure, the fuel pressure, map, intake air temperature sensor, coolant temperature sensor. Basically all the sensors except for the CAS I've been able to test, and everything seems to work good. So we also just got in our AEM X Series wideband controllers for the 2 wideband gauges we need in the exhaust. Those have been installed. I managed to wire those up as well. I have never worked with the AEMnet CAN bus before, aside from my, in my car I have a BTI CAN gauge that you just basically plug in. But on this one, because we're running 2 devices on the CAN bus in parallel, I had never done that before. I wasn't sure how to wire it up, but it's actually really easy. So I made up all the connections for that. That's all done. I've got over here is the Vibrant vacuum manifold. So we're going to install that in the corner here with the fuel pressure regulator and stuff. So that's going to distribute vacuum signal to the map, to the fuel pressure regulator, to the boost controller, and basically anything else that might need it. Not sure yet if I'm going to feed the blow-off valves off of that because they're going to be up here in the front. So I'm thinking instead we might run 2 vacuum lines to a T just below the, like where the valve covers here, or the timing covers are, just behind it, and then kind of across the intake plenum valley, and kind of go back to the, there's a tube, if you don't know these engines very well, like I didn't. There's a tube that goes between both sides of the plenum to balance out the pressure on each side, the airflow, which is why it's called a balance tube. And there's a couple vacuum nipples on the back of it, so I'll probably run one of those to the blow-off valves. Okay, so here is the engine in its current form. It is in the car, obviously, and it's running. It's running low boost right now. We have not had it dyno tuned yet. That's going to be hopefully this spring. But in the meantime, I'll kind of give you a tour of what everything is. We've got silicone hoses wherever possible. All the wiring, of course, is brand new. The entire wiring harness was built by Wiring Specialties. And then I stripped the entire thing down, ripped out everything that wasn't needed to run this engine as it sits because there's no more emissions and a bunch of other crap that wasn't needed. So that's all been removed. And then I completely rewrapped the entire thing. One of the other things that we did, okay, I guess I have to zoom back in again, which you can barely see down here, in there, is coil pack conversion. These are Audi coil packs, or VW. I mean, same difference. They're the 2-liter turbo. I think they fit the 1.8T as well. I don't know. I'm not too familiar with those guys, but it's a really easy swap. It tidies things up a lot because there's no coil wires on top of the plenum to deal with, and you don't have the coil sticking up that look kind of ugly. The only downside, and this is a pretty big downside, if you want to remove one of these coil packs to change a spark plug or whatever, you have to remove the entire upper intake plenum, which on this car isn't too bad because it's had a lot of deletes done, no emissions, like I said, no EGR, yada, yada, yada. So all you gotta do is unbolt the bolts that hold the plenum on, remove the intake, the idle air control valve stuff comes off, of course the piping here comes off, and the cover and the throttle cable comes undone, and then it pretty much just lifts right off. So that's kind of nice because all the injector wiring and everything like that is all underneath it, including the coil pack wiring. So there's nothing to unplug wiring wise to get that out. So that's pretty sweet. But like I said, it sucks for if you have to change plugs like quickly. Or when I was timing this engine, that was obviously a pain in the ass because to get a timing light on that, I had to basically take the engine cover off or take the plenum off, put a little extension on the coil so I could wrap my timing light pickup around it. So I couldn't run the engine with the timing light. It just didn't pick up the wiring off the coils itself, so that kind of sucked. Speaking of timing, if I come around here, another thing that's hard to see, it's you probably won't be able to see it at all because the ISO in this camera won't go high enough, but you can barely make out right there. The CAS is gone. It's been replaced with an inductive sensor. So the old Nissan cam angle sensor is typically, it's an optical sensor. and you know, there's a little light that shines through a disc, and the disc has a bunch of slots cut in it, and as the disc spins and the engine spins, the sensor picks up those changes in light and then tells the ECU where the engine's position is. It was giving me a lot of trouble, and they've been known to be unreliable as they age, so we replaced it with that. Because it's optical, there's no connection to any of the parts. So there's a wheel that's attached to the cam that spins with magnets on it, and then the inductive pickup is just sitting ever so slightly off from contacting that wheel, and it just picks up the signal. And the kit comes with an adapter to plug it right into the existing cast wiring, so you don't need to mess around with anything. However, I did have to repin the plug on this one because this had the older style connector on it, because this is a 90, and then I think as early as 91 or maybe 92 going up, they changed the connector. So that's the only thing with this one, is I had to change that, but that's not a big deal. The plug's $6, and you just repin it. And that's made by AutoDream. If you're looking for that, I don't have a link handy for it. I could probably put one in the description, but AutoDream makes it. There's a couple places I think that resell it under a different brand, but AutoDream in Calgary that's the place you want to go if you want to get one. So that works great. Now everything, like I said, it runs fine. Everything runs good. There is an issue right now where it's peaking at about 5 psi boost no matter what we do with it. So I'm gonna have to do a boost leak test on it and maybe check to make sure none of the wastegates are stuck open or something, because I had to mess around with the wastegate actuator to get it to the engine to fit. Maybe something's binding and getting stuck open. So we'll look at that. We got twin HKS blow-off valves. Those were on the car prior to this build, but you know, we kept them. They got powder coated in chrome, which looks really dull right now because they're not clean, but trust me, they look pretty sweet. Coolant pipes are also matching all the other purple stuff, which are just dirty. There's nothing on them. They're not scratched or anything like that, just dirt. So I think that's about all there is to it. Well, guys, there you have it. I hope that kind of gave you some insight on you know, the process of building a VG30 and putting it in a 300ZX. The build was definitely one of the most involved projects that I've ever taken on, so it was fun and interesting, and definitely a learning experience. So if you have any questions about anything, obviously, just like I said before, let me know and I'll answer the best I can. I'm definitely not an expert on this sort of stuff, but I think I know enough now that you know, I can help you guys out with most of the basic stuff. So if you like the video, of course, make sure you give it a like. Make sure that if you aren't subscribed, you do subscribe, because I do have more stuff coming. I've got more stuff to do with the R34, and we will probably be doing more work on this. You know, when it goes to the dyno and stuff, I'm going to film that. So don't miss that. As always, I'm Garrett. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.